we're going to look at one of my favorite Psalms, Psalm 104. I'll probably continue to talk about why I love it all through the study of it, but I'll just say as a way of introduction that my personal experience with this Psalm is to kind of first read it in a way that really latched on in my thinking and in my affections around the same time that we started to build our house here and to be able to transition into doing more farming and agrarian work, which I still don't do as much of as I'd like to, but to have a much closer awareness of our dependence on God's sustaining daily grace through how he gives us the world to live in. And that was alongside of a time when I really grew in my fondness and appreciation for the Psalms. And when I read this Psalm, it just clicked for me one day, and I was just blown away to think that this is a text that I'd never heard preached, never heard someone talk about it in reference to Genesis 1 and 2. And what an awesome next step for the significance of God as creator this psalm is when you tie it into the account of Genesis. And so that's just my personal, how I've came to know and love the psalm, but it's one that I think about often when I look out and see something particularly beautiful, or when we get an inch of rain after a couple weeks without it in June or July, or when we don't get rain and I'm left wondering if we're going to have enough grass to feed cows, or what's happening, drought-wise in our area. And so I've just really come to think about this psalm, I bet you, on a weekly basis. And so I'm also going to add an awesome song about Psalm 104 from Sandra McCracken to the YouTube playlist. And that also makes me think about the opening verses to this psalm quite often. So I'll read the psalm and then we'll study it for a few minutes together. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord, my God, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty, covering yourself with light as with a garment, stretching out the heavens like a tent. He lays the beams of his chambers on the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot. He rides on the wings of the wind. He makes his messengers winds, his ministers a flaming fire. He set the earth on its foundations so that it should never be moved. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took to flight. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place that you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. You make springs gush forth in the valleys. They flow between the hills. They give drink to every beast of the field. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. Beside them the birds of the heavens dwell. They sing among the branches. From your lofty abode you water the mountains. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your work. You cause the grass to grow for the livestock, and plants for man to cultivate, that he may bring forth food from the earth, and wine to gladden the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and bread to strengthen man's heart. The trees of the Lord are watered abundantly, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. In them the birds build their nests. The stork has her home in the fir trees. The high mountains are for wild goats. The rocks are a refuge for the rock badgers. He made the moon to mark the seasons. The sun knows its time for setting. You make darkness, and it is night. When all the beasts of the forest creep about, the young lions roar for their prey, seeking their food from God. When the sun rises, they steal away and lie down in their dens. Man goes out to his work and to his labor until the evening. O Lord, how manifold are your works! In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Here is the sea, great and wide, which teems with creatures innumerable, living things both small and great. There go the ships and Leviathan, which you formed to play in it. Though these all look to you to give them their food in due season. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with good things. When you hide your face, they are dismayed. When you take away their breath, they die and return to their dust. When you send forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. May the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works, who looks on the earth and it trembles, who touches the mountains and they smoke. I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have being. May my meditation be pleasing to him, for I rejoice in the Lord. Let sinners be consumed from the earth, and let the wicked be no more. Bless the Lord, O my soul. Praise the Lord. Those are the words of the Lord, and they are an incredible song of praise. And that's obviously the answer to my first question when we think about what form of psalm is this. This is obviously a hymn or a song of praise. It seems to have been meaningfully tied to Psalm 103 in the structure of the Psalter, just by virtue of Psalm 103 having that recurring refrain, bless the Lord, O my soul, bless the Lord, O my soul. And then Psalm 104 opens with bless the Lord, O my soul, and it ends with bless the Lord, O my soul, praise the Lord. We know that Psalm 103 is a Psalm of David. We don't have an authorship attributed to Psalm 104, but it seems quite possible, given the continued reference and the agrarian imagery, that it could have been or could be a Psalm of David. And when I think about the structure of this, I would say at least two things stand out to me. Well, one is the overall structure. There seems to be an introduction, which really may be as simple as just the first two lines. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. And then the closing, which I would say would be verses 31 on through the end of the song. This kind of result of considering God's creative and sustaining work leads to this just joyous proclamation. May the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works. May he look and do these things. I will sing to him as long as I live. I will meditate. I will rejoice. And let those who don't be consumed. That seems to be the opening and the closing. Everything in the middle is an interesting development of God's creating and sustaining work. And then the second thing about structure that I find interesting, and I really don't have as much to develop in this point, but it strikes me every time I read it, and it really helps me to focus, is that this songwriter keeps alternating his voice, or not his voice, but his audience. Notice how verses 3 through 5 are all about what God does, but he is apparently talking to man. The songwriter is. It says, he lays the beams of his chariots. He makes the clouds his chariot. He rides on the wings of the wind, etc. Every line, he. And then in verse 6, all of a sudden, the audience changes. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took to flight. Verse 10, you make springs gush forth. And verse 14, you cause the grass to grow. So the songwriter is almost seamlessly changing between looking sideways at those who he's singing to or imagining this declaration to other men. Look at all the things that God has done. And then he almost just, without even thinking, it causes him to make some of those boasts and praises to God himself. You know, look at all that God has done. Oh, God, you've done these great things. And that's I find that to be an extremely evocative way of describing the sustaining and creating act of God, to just express these incredible praises almost seamlessly between a horizontal audience, you know, talking to other men, and then this vertical audience where he just can't help but describe some of God's awesome work to God himself. That's a pretty awesome expression of praise. It's not one that I hear too often in our own worship songs. They tend to have one or the other. You know, we tend to either sing about God in a way that would indicate we're singing to someone that doesn't know these things or is a third party, or we sing them directly back to God in an act of worship. Neither of those are wrong, clearly. The psalmist does both of those here. But I think it's interesting to hear a song that does both of those at the same time. If you've got a hymn or a song of worship that alternates audience like that, I'd love to hear it. Because as I just think through it quickly, I don't have an example that springs to mind. Maybe Dad or Peggy will set me straight on this, and anyone else. From there, as you jump into kind of the body of this psalm, we see, you know, at first what may look to you like just kind of a haphazard laundry list of what comes into this songwriter's mind about God's creating and sustaining work in the world. But it actually, when you really slow down and look at it, seems to be taking the Genesis 1 account of creation and showing its practical significance for the modern audience. You know, verse 2, I guess I would say, kind of shows the very beginning of the creative act of Genesis 1, where we know that, you know, the earth was without form and void, and God came down and seemed to hover there. And we see that covering yourself with light stretched out over the heavens like a tent. And from there, this process of structuring the world begins, right? He lays the beams of his chambers on the water. He makes the clouds his chariot. He rides on the wings of the wind. And then from there, we see day 3 of the creation account in Genesis 1, which would be, I guess, verses 9 and 10. God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. That's verse 9. And God called the dry land earth, and the water that were gathered together he called the seas. Well, that looks a lot like verses 5 through 9 of Psalm 104. and very possibly even extending into verses 10 through 13 in this kind of way where verses 5 through 9 clearly are an artistic, melodic description of this act of creation. But then verses 10 through 13 kind of show how that creative act impacts the sustaining act, right? He set the earth on its foundations. He covered it with the deep. The water stood above the mountains, and mountains rose, valleys sank, and you described boundaries for everything. But then verses 10 through 13 kind of show what comes out of that. The waters then flow into the valley. The valleys flow so that the beasts get their drink, and the birds have a place. And then when God waters from the mountains down, right? He starts at the top, and water finds its lowest point. It always does. That's a roofer's undeniable law or rule. Water will find its lowest point, and I can remember learning how to put a roof on properly, and one contractor telling me all you have to do is be smarter than the water, and that's basically true, right? We can look and see, well, if water starts here in the mountains, we're going to eventually get it down here in the valleys. But that's because of the way that God created the world, not just gravity, but also elevation for gravity to take advantage of. And then to put it in words that point out the sustaining importance of this. God clearly was not a deist, according to this psalmist. This wasn't just something that God created once and set it in motion. It's clearly, he's not, I forget his name. He's not Ron Popeil, right? This is not a set it and forget it world. God created it in such a way that we can see how his handiwork works. We can see the mechanisms by which the world continues to function in a structured and proper order. But that doesn't mean God is absent from the work. And I think that's maybe another element of Psalm 104 that I love, which is that when you study biology or geography, or geology, or earth science, or you think about ecosystems, they often have this very mechanistic reduction to them, where we just learn about how this ecosystem works. This creature eats this creature, which eats this creature, which eats this creature, and when that creature dies, the compost feeds this creature, which feeds this creature, and so on and so on. And there's your circle of life, in Elton John's words. But that's true. There is structure to the world. We have laws of physics, but we still don't understand how we got those laws of physics. And we do need to realize that all of these ecosystems that are mechanistic in how they work still need energy. They still need water. And God dispenses these things in a way that this psalmist just nails for me, or at least causes me to truly appreciate God's gift of common grace. It's something that I think we take for granted, that we can look out and see a sunset and see it as beautiful. You can go to the desert and see it as beautiful. You can look at a snowstorm and see it as beautiful. You can go to the seashore and find it beautiful. Why is it that our hearts find these things beautiful? What causes us to recognize beauty? We often say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and we're talking usually about people when we say that. But why do people, as a general rule, find all of natural creation to be beautiful? Well, I think it's reflective of its maker. And that's why when we have the maker in our proper focus, when we're looking at creation, it causes us to worship, like the psalmist in Psalm 104. So we're at day 3 through verse 13. Then we get also into day 3. We see vegetation and trees, verses 14 through 17. And again, he puts them in such helpful context to us. In Genesis 1, we see these things created, right? Verse 12 of Genesis 1 says, "The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their kind, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind." And that's an objective truth about what God did. But some of the meaning of that is beautifully described in Psalm 104. I mean, verses 14 through 15 really kind of point out why plants really matter to me, right? They cause grass to grow so that cows can eat grass and I can eat cows. They cause 3 kinds of grain or fruit to grow that really matter to me. One, grapes or things that allow us to create tasty drinks, things that allow us to create oil. Think of olives and now various grains that we use to make oil, and wheat or things that we use to make bread. So you have here in just 2 verses this psalmist pointing out that the third day of creation was also God creating our food in such a way that we can enjoy it. We get all of our meat, dairy, eggs from livestock. We get all of our food from the earth, from this vegetation that he made for us and allows to continue to grow because the springs come forth from the valley. He then, of course, gave us the moon and the sun in day 4 of creation, but in verses 19 through 23 of Psalm 104. He made the moon to mark the seasons. The sun knows it's time for setting, darkness and light. And man is given as a gift a way to use the dark and the light to set his work schedule. We go out and we labor until the evening. I think maybe an unfortunate consequence of the Industrial Revolution is maybe a lack of a tie to the importance of day and night. There's an amazing book by a philosopher whose name was Arizim Kohak, and the book is called "The Embers and the Stars," and he talks about what we lost in the creation of artificial light, lampposts and the Edison light bulb, and now we have people working in warehouses through all hours of the night, and no longer tied to the day and to the night as closely as we used to be, and we may have lost something in that. But the psalmist here points out what we all know is true, that the sun and the moon are not just celestial bodies that God created, but they are order-giving entities that keep our lives structured. We have obviously our day and our year, all built around these as significant to us. Then, of course, you see the psalmist in verses 25 and 26 talking about the creatures of the sea that God made, which was day 5 of creation. And then all through kind of verses 21 through the end of the chapter, you see man and the animals of the earth also being described. And then verses 27 through 30 kind of wrap up this account of creation by saying all of these things look to God for the ongoing nature of his sustaining grace. We look to him to give us our food. When he does give us our food, us and all other creatures on the earth gather it, and when he deals bountifully with our area, we're delighted, and when he withholds, we're dismayed, and ultimately when he takes a creature's breath away, be that man or animal, they die. I mean, and through the sustaining work of the Spirit, they are created. Man, that for me puts a very real and practical significance on the doctrine of God as creator. In a way, to me, my doctrine of creation is even more formed by Psalm 104 than it is by Genesis 1 and 2. And don't get me wrong, that's not me discounting the Genesis account, but I see this as extremely significant in how we think about God as our sustaining creator. The Psalms talk about it all the time, maybe even more frequently than they talk about God being our Redeemer. And I think we, even as we in our circles have fought for creation as a historical event described accurately by the Bible, we may get caught up in the theology and the defense of it even more than we do in its practical significance to how we understand who God is and what he has done, is doing, and will do for us. That is, he is a sustaining God. He gives the water and the grass and the grapes and the wheat, and he cares for us. He deals bountifully with us, and at times less bountifully, and all of this is done according to his will for his glory. And man, I love being able to worship God because of what he's created and has done for us. Well, that's one of my favorite Psalms. I hope it's been an encouragement to you. The next time we get together to study, I plan to study Psalm 116. It has some well-known lines in it and is a beautiful psalm about loving God even in some difficult scenarios. So I look forward to studying with you next time. And again, I look forward to studying these things someday soon in person. I love and miss CBC. I'm very thankful for those of you who have encouraged me and my family even through this time of being apart from one another. So God bless you all, and we'll talk to you soon.